So America's Public Forum is an event series that Braver Angels has been running for about the last year on and off, and we're doing more of them nowadays with various partners, including American Purpose. And the idea has always been to link up the world of grassroots depolarization, civil discourse work with the world of honest and hardworking and insightful policy journalists and policy scholars who are helping advance a lot of understandings of different things related to the American political system. And we're especially excited to work with American Purpose on this one today because the questions of truth and reality and the relationship to politics, questions of public epistemology, as you might think of it, are very, very interesting, very, very important. And Jonathan Rauch has been an interesting thinker on them for quite some time, so we're just happy to have him here. So with that, I will go ahead and hand things off to Craig Kennedy. Just another quick announcement for those of you who are coming in a little bit late. If you're coming in from a Braver Angels link, there is a chance that you are named Luke Phillips on your Zoom name. Please go ahead and change that name to whichever your real name is. So with that, let me hand over to Craig Kennedy. Craig Kennedy is a board member at American Purpose, and he will be the MC for the event today. Craig, handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and thanks to Braver Angels for partnering with American Purpose for this event. It's a real treat to host Jonathan Rauch for this conversation. Jonathan is a distinguished and eclectic writer, now based at the Brookings Institution. Earlier in his career, he wrote Out Nation, one of the best books by an American author on Japan. 2004, he wrote an eloquent book on the importance of gay marriage. And several years ago, he penned The Happiness Curve, a thoughtful book on why old people like me tend to be happier than we were in middle age. But one of his themes throughout his writing has been this issue of truth, or the search for truth. Early in 1993, and it's when I first met him, he wrote Kindly Inquisitors, which made the case for the importance of defending free speech on college campuses, still a relevant topic today. And now he's come out with a new book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. It's an incisive and provocative defense of the institutions and processes that sort fact from fiction and knowledge from false claims and spurious theories. Welcome, Jonathan. And why don't we kick it off this way? Could you just give us a brief summary of your book and why you wrote it?
Sure, I'd love to. And of course, I'll preface that with thanks to you and Jeff Gedman and Braver Angels, of which I'm was a founding board member. And there's so many friends, old friends on this call that I'd love to call you all out, but it would take too long. So thank you all for coming. It's the fulfillment of a dream to be here today with this particular book. The Constitution of Knowledge is our social system for coming to social agreement about facts and staying moored to reality, and doing that without having civil war and chaos. It's in many ways parallel, not just metaphorically, but in terms of the actual structure and operation. It's in many ways parallel to the US Constitution, meaning not just, the words on paper that were signed in 1789, but the whole system of social negotiation and compromise and persuasion and groups and pitting ambition against ambition that the US Constitution embodies. Many of the same mechanisms are what we rely on to come to social agreement about truth. And those mechanisms are under a very large scale and worrisome attack today from several quarters. And that's why I wrote the book, to understand, first of all, the nature of this system that we all rely on, because most people, I think, don't. They just think, knowledge happens automatically from free speech and the marketplace of ideas. It doesn't. We need a lot more than that. And second, to understand how these attacks are trying to undermine those structures, and then how to respond to those attacks.
Okay, thank you. So one big significant part of your book is a terrific analysis of Donald Trump and the way he bended truth, distorted truth, and used it for his own ends. I didn't think that I was going to read anything new about this topic, given all of the attention, but your book has it. One of the things that you talk about is how various institutions, Facebook, Twitter, major mainstream media, really fought back against this process. What are the lessons that come out of the Trump experience in terms of preserving the integrity of the Constitution of knowledge?
Well, the big lesson, and one of the two big points in my book, the first being that there is a constitution of knowledge, but the second is you're being manipulated. A lot of people look at Donald Trump and the forces behind them and think, well, you know, fortunately, the man was a buffoon and he couldn't really damage the Constitution or the country very much. And that's wrong, because in the epistemic sphere, the information sphere, the zone of truth, he is, I argue, the greatest propaganda wielder since the 1930s, since, for example, Joseph Goebbels, and that what he did was so audacious that no one had even dreamt of it before, much less implemented it. And that's applying Russian-style disinformation tactics like the fire hose of falsehood and trolling and conspiracy bootstrapping, adopting them and applying them wholesale to US politics, with the stunningly effective result that about 3/4 of Republicans now believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And when I say you're being manipulated, what I want people to understand is that this society is increasingly polarized and divided and uncivil and cynical and conspiratorial, not just because of, you know, general social factors like, you know, the internet is a problem and institutions have failed and all these things you hear, you know, okay, fine, we can talk about those things. But a major reason, maybe the major reason, is that we've been under systematic epistemic attack for a period of years, deliberately aimed at targeting truth and targeting our ability to reach truth and agree on truth as a society, and it's working. So we've got to understand it in order to fight it.
So you spend a good deal of time in your book talking about how Facebook, Twitter, other platforms really were important in fighting back against Trump. I guess one of the questions I would ask is, can they go too far sometimes in stopping disinformation? And I'm thinking about how Facebook and Twitter took a very tough line on the idea that COVID-19 originated in a Chinese lab. And now this story is kind of resurfaced and taken on new legitimacy. Is it dangerous to let these platforms kind of manage the defense of the Constitution of knowledge?
It's difficult because there's no easy way to do it. And we're just at the very beginning of the process of trying to establish some epistemic guardrails and institutions like the Facebook Oversight Board, which can begin to teach us how to make these decisions. And it's going to take a while. What's happening now is trial and error, and some of it is random, and some of it is not going to work, and some of it is misguided, and that's inevitable. The last time we had a major information disruption, or last time, there've been a bunch of them, but the one that I think is the most interesting is the transition from 19th century yellow journalism and massive fake news and extreme partisanship, which is what we had, to the modern age of pretty reliable mainstream journalism. Sure, it makes mistakes. It may have made a mistake in dismissing the lab release theory, but it also corrects those mistakes. And it's now doing that with a massive postmortem, understanding what went wrong. And the way we made that transition was consciously. Things got so bad that starting in the early 20th century, people in the industry and elsewhere got together and said, look, we got to shape things up. So the American Society of Newspaper Editors was formed. The first thing it did was issue ethics codes of conduct, things like you should run corrections, you should be accurate. That was kind of a new idea in American journalism. Journalism schools were set up and they taught people and they propounded these ethics. Prizes were set up like the Pulitzer, the National Magazine Award, many other incentives that help journalists begin to focus more on truth and have incentives to do that. Well, we're in the early stages of that kind of process now. And no, I'm not saying that Facebook has solved it. Not even close, not even close. No one should get that impression. But I am saying that what's a good thing is that social media platforms have come to understand that being an epistemic sewer is bad for business and bad for America. And they are at last turning their attention toward fixing it. And that's an important start.
So one of the other themes in your book is you're reminiscing about being trained as a journalist and the really high standards that were inculcated in you and others that were being trained at a newspaper in North Carolina and a student paper in Yale and elsewhere. Do you think the current crop of journalists still live up to this very high set of standards that you were trained under?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I did when I wrote this book is go talk to some young journalists. And I found them saying much the same thing, sort of things that we did. That, for example, it was drilled into me. Of course, everything has to go through an editor. Of course, I'm supposed to call someone for comment before I put their name in the paper. Of course, it's never fun to run a correction, but when I need to do it, I must do it. Of course, I should use second sourcing, for example. And of course, I work for the community, not just a particular newspaper. These were the ethics that were drilled into me. And when I talk to young journalists, they're still saying similar things. The challenge, Craig, is the biggest problem for American journalism is not epistemic, it's economic. The Constitution of Knowledge, being a member of that Constitution, what I call the reality-based community, it's expensive to find truth because there are a lot of protocols. There are people you have to consult. There's expertise you have to develop. There are many disciplines where you have to master a whole vocabulary just to get in the conversation. And that is, of course, way more expensive than attracting eyeballs by insulting people. So the young journalists I talk to are worried about whether they can maintain the standards that they want to maintain.
Okay.
And I'm worried about that too.
So let's shift to canceled culture. And I would just tell everybody, get your questions ready. John is the unusual guest on these Zoom sessions who's actually very concise in his answers. So even though I came up with 6 or 7 questions for him, he's rolling through them quite quickly. Cancel culture on campuses, you put much of the onus on students and the way students have been raised and their current values. My guess is that there's more than a few people on this session today that would also say that it's administrators and faculty are just as much a responsible party in what is going on our campuses as the students are. Could you just expand on how you view the situation on college and university campuses?
Well, first, it's all of the above. And second, I want to emphasize, as I do in the book, the cancel culture is not just a university problem. Right. It's a lot bigger than that. And what I mean by cancel culture is the use of social coercion and intimidation to intimidate, silence, isolate, demoralize your political opponents. That is a classic tactic of information warfare. It is a different tactic than the one that Trump and Putin uses, which is fire hose of falsehood and conspiracy theories, but it's aimed at the same target, which is demoralizing, deplatforming, confusing the target population so they can't be politically effective. And so we have polling on what's going on college campuses, and we have a lot of anecdotal evidence confirmed by the many interviews with professors and students that I did for my book. And what they're finding is that the nature of the free speech problem on campus has changed over the past 20 years since I wrote Kindly Inquisitors, when it was primarily groups of faculty and ideologues with some radical new notions about truth. It seems to be quite different now, because what students are saying is that they're most worried about other students. And they're reporting that professors, including, by the way, left-wing professors, and in classes are where they feel safest to have honest conversations. And that left-wing professors are going out of their way to foster open conversation. The problem seems to be primarily, not only, but primarily, that people are afraid of being ostracized by fellow students, being hit with attacks on social media, being potentially investigated if they're called out. And the further problem is that too often administrators allow this to happen by launching investigations of students or professors for First Amendment protected speech. So increasingly, we seem to be seeing a culture where peer pressure is driving chilling of opinions and discourse on campus. And that's a hard problem to solve because, you know, if a college has a speech code that's unconstitutional, you can sue and probably knock it down. If a college has an environment in which a minority of students, a small group, a pressure group, and that's usually what it is, it's not most students, it's typically a subgroup of students are able to use tactics of intimidation to silence others on campus and create a false consensus, preference falsification it's called, then that shuts down discourse on the campus and it distorts the pursuit of science and knowledge on the campus. And that's a harder problem to solve because it's in the social climate, you know, not written down on paper somewhere.
So I want to emphasize what you said at the beginning. You are very clear in the book, cancel culture is not just in academia, it's in many, many other institutions within our society. I think what I was also struck by, though, in your book is if you look at the forces that fought back against Trump and his approach to non-truth, you had major news networks, you had major newspapers, you had academia, you had most of Hollywood that all took a very strong stand in opposition to what he was doing and saying. When I look at the issue of cancel culture and even the examples you give of the kind of counter reaction, it seemed much more feeble, much less organized, and frankly, not as compelling as what we saw taking on Trump. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a fair assessment as of June 11th, 2021. My hope and maybe even cautious expectation is that it won't be as fair an assessment on June 11th, 2022. So, but yeah, Craig, you are right. Part of the reason that it seems like cancel culture and authoritarian versions of wokeness, anti-racism, intersectionality, by authoritarian versions, I mean not just the ideas themselves, but the tendency to want to impose them by stigmatizing, silencing, intimidating anyone who disagrees with them. That seems to have just come out of nowhere and just taken over and dominated not only universities, but newsrooms, increasingly HR departments and employers, corporations, you name it. And there's a reason for that, which is organized minorities can defeat disorganized majorities every time, especially if the organized minorities, take the disorganized majorities by surprise. And that's what happened. No one was ready for the kinds of tactics, the social tactics that were going to be used and that were then turbocharged by social media. You know, until about 2014, when the campaign against Mozilla's Brandon Ike, I think, alerted some of us to where we were headed. You know, it was really hard to organize a campaign to get someone fired. You know, you'd have to write a lot of letters and there were going to be repercussions and it was going to be hard. Now it's trivially easy. You can get someone fired overnight. It happens all the time just by making them controversial, make them radioactive. And the counselors were much quicker to understand these technologies and to understand their potential use as forces for intimidation. So they organized quickly and they just, you know, they took the world by storm. No one was ready. So what we're starting to see happen is that the center left and actually liberal progressives, meaning progressives who believe in pluralism and free speech and believe that all topics should be open to debate, they have tumbled to the fact that cancel culture is not just about circumscribing particular and defined ideas. It's about manipulating the information environment so everything is chilled. No one knows what's safe. And they have realized that progressives are targets of these same tactics and are special targets of these same tactics because conservatives are often inured to controversy. You know, they kind of expect it, but the progressive professor who may stray off the reservation completely by accident in many cases and gets slammed, that's a very soft target. Progressives now, I think, have started to wake up to what's going on here and are starting to push back. And we're seeing the organization of whole bunches of groups across the culture with names like the Academic Freedom Alliance, the Foundation Against Racism and Intolerance, Counterweight.org, Princetonians for Free Speech, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and existing groups like the Foundation for Institutional Rights and Education are starting some important and big new campaigns. And what we're starting to see is counter mobilization. And that's the key, because if you know anything about government, you know the reason we have farm subsidies is because a few people care about them a lot and no one cares about them much at all. But if you can start to organize a counter majority and you start to push back, the ability of these small pressure groups to intimidate can crumble very quickly. So I'm not saying that will happen. I'm saying it can happen, and it depends on the rest of us to organize, not just sit around and moan.
So, John, I've watched efforts to get rid of farm subsidies fail
Yeah.
for the last 40 years. So I'm not sure I'd use that as the example. But do you think that these efforts...
Point taken, Craig.
Do you think that these efforts are going to have any real traction if, say, the New York Times and Washington Post don't start to weigh in with the same vigor that they did in going after Trump?
Well, you know, I don't want to say everything depends on two institutions, because it doesn't. A lot of what's going to happen is the building of new institutions and new coalitions. And, you know, I was just saying to some other journalists just literally yesterday, you know, what there needs to be is a journalist committee for objectivity and diversity. And this would be a committee that would back journalists who take the position that journalism should be objective and not necessarily woke. And it should give them support if they push back, because often they don't get that in newsrooms. They're just run over by progressive colleagues. I won't name names, but you all know where I'm talking about. And other people said, yeah, that should happen. Now, I'm not going to organize this today or tomorrow, but I think it could happen. And I think once those organizations start to happen, yeah, I think actually, potentially, the historical example, Craig, is once liberals, pluralists, people who believe in true intellectual diversity and open discourse, once we organize and fight back, we do very, very well. And I give you as an example of that, the fact that legal freedom of speech is at its all-time high in America right now. And that's because of, you know, the ACLU and lots of other people who worked on this. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's inevitable. Don't be complacent, but be hopeful. We can push back. We have lots of tools to do that. And I think it's just the beginning of the second quarter of the game, and our team is just starting to suit up.
I love your optimism, John.
Hope. It's hope, not optimism.
Okay, your hope.
We could get this wrong too. You know,
I am sure that someone is going to ask you if the ACLU really is the defender of free speech now that it once was, but we're going to turn to questions. I'm going to go to Hal Conte first. But before I do so, let me give a shout out to our colleague, Gabe Schoenfeld, who's going to have a review of your book up on American Purpose. When, Michelle?
That's going to be just around the release date of the book, June 22nd.
Okay, so let me turn to Hal Conte, and after that it'll be Lawrence Haas. I'm going to just take them in the order that I received them here. Hal?
Thank you. I really strongly appreciate that. I am a young journalist. I also am really grateful that I believe that I'm going to be going to the United Kingdom pretty soon on a grant. But my question is this, and this is something I've thought about a lot. Is the bigger threat to discourse today, or the more important thing for people who want to kind of return discourse to the state that it was at, I guess, at one point, to reestablish a common basis for truth, i.e. you can have the New York Times or an outlet like that where people might disagree on what they want to do, but they agree on what the truth is? Or is it more important to have this plurality of opinions? Because I can see those, oftentimes those ideas are conflicted, i.e. maybe something like QAnon, okay, that's pretty obvious, but something like the lab leak theory, is it more important to say, well, we need to have this kind of common basis to discuss things, and we don't want there to be things that undermine the notion of truth itself, but at the same time, you also need to avoid the idea that certain ideas are like considered too fringe to be discussed in the mainstream, because then important things could be neglected due to cancel culture on the left or the right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a very important distinction there to make. So in this book, I think I've invented Madisonian epistemology, which is a mouthful, but it means that we take the same ideas that motivate the US Constitution and we've transferred them over the past 200 years to the realm of science, journalism, academia, and so on. Madison's great insight is you're never going to have a republic, least of all a large republic, where everyone's going to agree on much of anything. And his great insight is that's a feature, not a bug. If you manage that effectively, you can convert conflict into cooperation by requiring people to compromise. And that's what the Constitution does. It creates all these different power centers and all these checks and balances so that factions have to deal with other factions and work out answers right now, as 10 senators just announced they did about infrastructure. Same thing is true in the Constitution of Knowledge. It does not presume a single final set of facts that everyone has to agree to. Totalitarian dictatorships do that. And historically, the Catholic Church did that. Illiberal systems did that. What distinguishes the Constitution of Knowledge, like the US Constitution, is it says, let's take the world as it is. Let's use disagreement and harness that as a source of energy. The key is to force people. You have to persuade people who disagree with you, who have different biases, that you're right in order to make knowledge. And only when a lot of them say, okay, you're probably right, do your ideas go into the textbooks? So what we've got to agree on here is the process, not the outcome. That's like a good bumper sticker definition of liberalism. The forces that are targeting the system are trying to demolish that process by attacking the institutions that do it and the norms that underlie it. That's what's happening. You know, when Trump is falsifying weather reports that have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration seal on them, he's falsifying the facts and the institution that makes the facts. So yes, thank you. What we're out to defend here is the system we have that turns conflict into knowledge, and that depends above all on pluralism. As in Madison's system, you've got to have people with different points of view. One of the things that worries me a lot in academia is there are now whole fields in academia, especially in the liberal arts and social sciences, the humanities, where there just essentially are virtually no conservatives, either in universities or in the pipeline. And that just guarantees you make mistakes. That guarantees folks won't find the biases that may be blinding them to other points of view. We got to work on that. We've got to have pluralism. We've got to have a commitment to pluralism, especially in academia. Also, by the way, newsrooms. When newsrooms get too uniformly left-wing, and again, you know who I'm talking about, I won't name names, their news coverage becomes less objective, less useful, less truthful.
Okay, thank you. Next, Lawrence Haas, and after that, it'll be Giselle Donnelly.
Lawrence, who?
Yes, hello, Craig, and hello, Jonathan. So before asking my question, I hope this is okay, that I'm going to say that I was honored enough to have an advanced copy of the book, which I devoured. It is absolutely wonderful, and I really hope that all of you read it, and I hope it sells millions. Now, with regard to the question, I wanted to ask you, even though I did read the book, I'm not recalling exactly how you dealt with this, but you know, we talk about the organs of communication now, and Facebook and others that are beginning to think about processes and structures to sort of monitor and clean up the sewage. And in essence, you know, so the clearest example is Trump is not on Twitter, he's not on Facebook. Yeah, As soon as those kinds of things start happening, you've got this inherent tension between the desire for truth and constraints on free speech. Because, you know, the beauty of free speech is that it's the freedom to offend, and it's the freedom to be wrong. Now you get into this question of, well, purposeful wrongness, the Trump Putin way of you know, fouling the atmosphere. But how do you kind of navigate this inherent tension between wanting to tilt the playing field toward truth and cleansing the playing field that way, and constraints on free speech that raise all sorts of other questions?
So thank you. It's a very hard question, obviously. I think that the answer begins with realizing that it's not a binary choice between censorship and freedom, which is too often how this is presented, an all or nothing choice in which people are either banned from Twitter or Facebook, that did happen to Trump, or there are no controls at all. Absolutely anything goes. The reality-based community, of which you and I, Larry, as journalists and writers are part, doesn't typically ban people. In fact, it almost never does unless they've committed severe professional malfeasance. But it does make discriminations about whether to amplify or disamplify their work. So if a journalist has a bad record and consistently gets things wrong, they're going to have a harder time getting published. They're going to be checked much more heavily. What they do publish is not as likely to get picked up. If, on the other hand, you're a journalist or you're a scientist and the work you do is consistently good, your reputation will build, your ideas will be amplified through the system. We need to think of the community of knowledge, the reality-based community. I liken it to pumping and filtering stations on a network, like, you know, oil refinery network or a water network. There's no one way through it. There's no single pathway where one entity is in a position to say up or down, true or false. There are lots of ways through it, but they all go through these nodes like newsrooms, journals, peer review, fact checking, legal review. And at any given stage, people and organizations are looking at these claims and saying, is this good enough to send elsewhere in the system? Or do we just basically, you know, squelch it? Is this just an unfounded claim? If you get that right, you get a system which very quickly transmits better ideas and very quickly suppresses bad ones, not by banning them. You know, I can say that I have fillings in my teeth that are, you know, run by the CIA and controlling my mind, but I will have a very hard time getting NIH to do research on that. They just won't even bother to acquire it. So that's how we do it. So the trick here, transporting that idea to social media and digital media, isn't just to rely on these up-down hard decisions in hard cases, which are always going to be difficult. It's to figure out how to rejigger the product and the algorithms and the incentives so that stuff that is more truthful and more pro-social is more likely to be transmitted through the system than stuff that is false and antisocial and so forth. Right now, the incentives are backwards. If you want to get famous on social media, you lie and you troll, because the more outrageous you are, the more people pay attention to you. This is how the human mind works, unfortunately. Outrage is sticky, it's addictive. There are ways to change that by changing the incentives in the system and the product design. I believe Jack Dorsey is right when he says that the key to solving this thing won't be primarily making policy decisions like who gets to tweet and who doesn't get to tweet, or what about this tweet or what about that tweet. It's going to be in changing the nature of these platforms and the way they're designed. So that, for example, what Twitter is doing right now is, the other day I retweeted a link and I hadn't read it on Twitter. Actually, I had read it, but somewhere else. But I couldn't retweet that without first being interrupted by a pop-up that said, are you sure you want to retweet this without reading it? That's a way to slow down and get people to think. It sounds like a small thing, but a host of changes of incentives like that are what makes science work. all of these little incentives and adjustments, and they're not going to be the same across any two platforms.
Okay, Giselle Donnelly, then we're going to go to Sarah Strickland and then Tom Barson. There's about 10 people in the queue. We're going to get to as many as we can. So keep your questions short.
I'll
Giselle?
keep my answers short.
Oh, no, you're doing a great job. Giselle?
Hi, Giselle. So nice to see you. You're muted.
You're muted.
There we go. You'd think after 15 months on Zoom, I'd be quicker at that. So my question is short, but it is a recipe for a long answer. I'm really struck by how vividly you describe the current social and media landscape. And I'm also highly attracted to your solutions. But it's really hard to figure out how to get from point A to point B in this. Seems to me that that what you're advocating is a return to truth as an avenue to power through persuasion, whereas what we have today is the corruption by power of truth. And all the marketplace incentives, or certainly the balance, are to push the outrage button as frequently as possible. So the question is there an underlying imbalance that's been systemically introduced that really works against getting out of, and if you sort of look at the progression of the last decade or so, the urge to power is far greater than the pursuit of truth. Diogenes has to post on Substack these days. So tell us how to get from where how do we get from where we are, which you so richly described, to where you want to go, which is a much more attractive place?
The people look for the 3-point magic answer to the solution to the problem. This is not going to be like that. It hasn't ever been in the past. We've been through massive information disruptions, the inventing of the printing press, which unleashed the killings of witches across Europe, alleged witches, and massive religious wars. And that took, over a century to figure out, settle down. Taming American journalism and turning it into something reputable and reliable took several decades. This is going to take a while too. And to go back to the point I was talking about Craig with earlier, we must not be complacent. We must not assume that just, if we leave it alone, folks will figure it out. They must understand the problem, and that's the first step. And that begins, in my opinion, with changing the way we talk about this, so that, we tend to think, okay, well, we've got all these problems and they're kind of like natural disasters, or they're the products of these big amorphous social forces. Like, people have become more polarized and religion has declined and institutions have failed and our cognitive resources are stretched thin. And there's truth in all of that. We can have all those conversations, and we should, but we must not forget, big message number 2 in my book, you're being manipulated. This is being done to us on purpose by people seeking power and profit from doing it. And they're nameable people and nameable organizations. They include, but are not limited to, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, a whole section, I'd argue most, of the Republican Party, most or a lot of conservative media, cancel culture on the left. These are targeted focus campaigns against individuals designed to chill and intimidate. So the place to begin is understand that epistemic warfare is a real thing, and it is being used right now to polarize and divide and weaken our country, to make people cynical, to demolish trust in epistemic institutions. And only if we understand that can we start. Okay, once we understand that, where do we start? The answer is everywhere. This is an all of society problem in which a lot of adjustments all across society by all kinds of people and organizations is what makes the difference. We're talking here about everything from the kinds of social media platform redesigns that we've talked about, to media literacy education in schools, journalists getting savvier. That's happening. Media is much better now at understanding and covering disinformation. It's got a long way to go. But if you compare the way the 2020 disinformation was covered from 2016, leagues better. Helping people understand these tactics helps by itself because population's less vulnerable if it understands what's going on. There's a whole field that's emerging now. It's called mental immunity, cognitive immunity, which is how can you create structures that help guard against the spread of viral bad ideas. On the cancel culture side, I already mentioned what I think is maybe the most important development, which is counter mobilization. Because cancel culture is a classic case of small focused pressure groups that are able to dominate by intimidating others who are less organized and less effective. But it's all of these things, Giselle, right? And that's why I say not necessarily that I'm optimistic, but that I'm hopeful. In the past, those things have worked. They may not work this time, and they certainly don't work if we don't understand the nature of the problem, that we are being targeted by active forces, intelligent forces, learning forces that are out to undermine, divide, polarize. Is there a verb for synthesize? Our society. We got to start there.
Okay. Sarah Strickland, then Tom Barson, then Nicole Penn. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan, thank you for this. This is just very stimulating. I just recently read George Packard's article in The Atlantic, and I'm wondering how that article, if you have read it, informs this conversation, especially the last comments.
I am
that you
embarrassed to
made.
say I have not yet gotten to it. I will soon. George has a book coming out about this in about a week.
Yeah,
And I'm even more looking forward to that.
yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Tom Barson, please. You're muted. You're still muted. Why don't you work on that? Let's go to Nicole Penn and we'll come back. Nicole?
Hi, John. Great to see you. Thank you so much for this fabulous presentation.
Hi,
So,
thank you.
My one of the things that I've been mulling a lot is the platformification, if I could steal from you all, as I want to do, of society, and that is really encouraged by things like social media. That is, and I worry that I'm sounding almost un-American here, but I'm concerned that every man an expert. And this is really reinforced by social media, which gives everyone basically their own little mini newspaper, their newsletter. And I'm even more dismayed to see the rise of Substack, which is pulling really brilliant people away from institutions. So all that to say, do we need to treat social media as publishers? Should we actually move forward in that direction, which would undoubtedly enervate the whole enterprise? But maybe that's what we need. Maybe that would encourage the slowing down of information travel and would encourage folks to look at their own communities instead of getting outraged about, drag queen story hour in Pennsylvania when they live in Wyoming.
So if you check out the book, and of course I hope you will, my copy's out of reach, but I should be waving it. I'm told you're supposed to display the book at least 3 times in the course of every appearance. Craig, do you have a copy you can hold up?
No, because I just had to.
Yes, Jeff Gedman comes to the rescue. So that book there, you will find that I only rarely use the term social media platforms because I think it's misleading. It has never been the case that Facebook and Twitter, for example, are simply wide open spaces without any structure and no editorial decisions. They rely heavily on algorithms to do curation, to decide what we see and don't see. They do it, however, not on the basis of truth, but on the basis of other things. Now, in a newsroom, you're supposed to do it on the basis of truth. That's also, of course, story appeal and human interest and community service, but it has to be true or you're not supposed to put it in the paper. So I do regard social media as a form of publishing. What it's doing is it's gathering and soliciting a whole lot of content, bundling it together, attracting an audience and selling that audience to advertisers. Well, we do have a name for that. That name is publishing. And indeed, Facebook has publicly identified itself as a publisher in a lawsuit where it was seeking First Amendment protection to not have to publish stuff it doesn't want to publish. The complication is that these social media companies, digital media, as I prefer to call them, are four things simultaneously. Yes, they are platforms in the sense that they're places where everyone goes to, say stuff. They are also, however, communities, and they are publishers, and they are businesses. And those other three categories not only permit, but require active content choices. You can't have a community or a publisher or a business that doesn't make some choices. So their dilemma is to figure out how to balance these things better than they have in the past, and how to balance them all in keeping with an ethic that is friendly to truth instead of hostile to truth. And that is a really hard problem, but the beginning of wisdom is, Nicole, what I think you just said, which is it's now counterproductive to just say these are platforms, they lack all structure, they lack incentives, and they don't make choices, because it just isn't true. And it leads us to think about the situation, the choices we have to make in the wrong way.
Okay. Tom Barson, if you can get your sound going, then it'll be Michael Allen and then Greg Watling.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Craig. Quick practical question. I have a granddaughter starting college this fall, and the dilemma of college students, as you painted it, really grabbed me. Are there 3 or 4 takeaways from your book that could be fashioned into some sort of constitutionalist credo for someone about to go into this situation? And
well, that's an easy one, because the last chapter of the book is called Unmute Yourself. And the second half of it is addressed primarily to students. So one of the things that's going to make a difference is when progressive students get tired of being bullied by small factions among them who want to silence them. That's starting to happen. Surveys show that students on the left are tired of being pushed around, and students on the left want to hear more conservative speakers. And that's going to change the dynamic when they begin counter-organizing and putting contrary pressure on administrators to open the campus to unsafe ideas instead of closing it. So that's going to help if and when it starts to happen. Might be just starting to germinate. But the other big lesson is unmute yourself. So again, you're being manipulated is the big theme here. These are sophisticated information warfare tactics that are designed to dominate, divide, disorient, and demoralize their targets. And emphasize that word demoralize. It's what Trump is doing. It's what Putin is doing. It's what counselors are doing on campus. And that's to make people feel like there's no point even fighting back. You can never keep up with the flood of half-truths. There's just no point getting yourself investigated if you're going to graduate anyway. In 2 years, why lose all your friends? And they're so powerful anyway. They have such control of the commanding heights of the university and the administration and the larger culture that there's no point even fighting. That's what they want. That is the end which they are seeking. They want to demoralize you so you don't fight back, and then they're in control. The answer to that, it turns out, is that you do fight back. And the way you do that is you unmute yourself. People will not be silenced if they don't allow themselves to be silenced. And students will find other supportive students once they join each other in speaking out. So what I tell your daughter is, it's not the worst thing in the world if some people don't want to sit with you because you've challenged some sacred cow among some quarter of campus, and you will be surprised how many people will actually come to you and say, I think you're right, or I'm glad you spoke out. You can choose not to be thin-skinned, not to be, to use that term, a snowflake. And the burden is on, I can't remember if it's a daughter or son. The burden is on them. I guess that's
a
what
granddaughter, but it's okay.
Granddaughter. Yeah, we'll call it the burden is on her, I think, to enter college with the expectation that to get the experience that she signed up for, real pluralism, real debate, that's going to have to start with her.
Okay. Michael Allen and then Greg Vodley.
Thank you. There was a recent survey, excuse me, I can't recall whether it was Cato or Pew, that found that 1/3 of respondents felt unsafe about expressing their political views in a workplace for fear of losing their job or losing an employment opportunity, which is quite a staggering statistic when you think about it. I mean, Pat Moynihan famously said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. But clearly, many Americans even feel now that they're not entitled to their own opinions for fear of dismissal or other economic disadvantages. But my question is really about what you call epistemic communities, or the ecosystem of knowledge. As I started to read your book, I was reminded of my father, who was a non-college educated working guy with construction, read tabloid newspapers, had some dodgy political views, but he would also listen to BBC lectures by Isaiah Berlin or A.G.P. Taylor, the historian. In other words, people like him were conscious that there was a hierarchy of knowledge, a hierarchy of credibility. But that kind of ecosystem whereby certain academics, journalists, teachers, the clergy provided a filter for knowledge, particularly to lower class people, so to speak, has broken down now. And it seems to me it's not a coincidence that those categories, the academics, the clergy, the journalists, are rightly or wrongly seen as irrevocably liberal in the US as well as in the UK, by the way. So given this segmentation of credibility, what do you think are the prospects of establishing as it were, a new hierarchy of credibility, particularly given the lack of credibility that what we used to call public intellectuals have now in political discourse?
Great question.
Yeah, great question. Before I go to it, just want to underscore something that you said at the beginning, Michael, which is in some ways actually maybe the germ of a hopeful sign. So yes, a survey last July found that over 60% of Americans are afraid to state their true political opinions for fear of offending someone, i.e. being canceled. And a third of Americans are afraid that stating their true political opinions will cost them a job or job opportunities. But what's especially interesting about the latter statistic, and this will surprise you, as it surprised me, they have a spectrum of 5 ideological ratings in that poll, ranging from very liberal to very conservative, with the obvious middle groups. There's no difference in the level of chilling felt by liberals and conservatives in terms of their worry about their job loss. And that's really interesting because it's telling you that this is not just a problem of conservatives feeling chilled by liberals, it's a problem of liberals feeling chilled by authoritarians. And those are the people on the center and on the left, who have both the numbers and the cultural clout as they wake up to the fact that they are the targets of information warfare. Those are the people who can really fight back on this thing. So the broader question is, I think, a version of, can we establish trust, reestablish trust? Can we reestablish gatekeepers? It's very hard to do. People who look at reestablishing trust once it's been demolished, there's no easy road back. And we do have to remember, as you know, I hammer away at this because it's so easy to forget. This trust didn't just magically disappear. It's the result of a multi-decade targeted campaign to get us to doubt that there is such a thing as truth and that the institutions charged with finding it are doing a decent job. The answer is measures both micro and macro. I think it's important that universities and newsrooms do a better job of ending discrimination against conservatives, which has now been well documented in academic quarters. That won't immediately fill the pipeline in sociology with conservative scholars, but removing those obstacles and making clear that universities are just as committed to viewpoint diversity as they are to demographic diversity, over time, that will make a difference. And I think it will help restore credibility, and it absolutely needs to happen. Heterodox Community and some other academic organizations are starting to work on that. That's going to be the next big topic. And that's hard to do, and it needs to be done. Same is true in newsrooms, at least in places where you have basically a range of opinions in the newsroom from center left to far left. That won't work if we want people's trust and if we want to get the news right. And then there are all the macro measures we talked about. You can't just focus on individual places and say, how does that thing, you know, the New York Times or Oberlin College get its credibility back? You have to look at the whole information ecosystem and the attacks on it, and you have to begin countering them all kinds of places in all kinds of ways, creating an environment where you reduce the amount of polarization and mistrust overall, and you can begin to rebuild. So yeah, it sounds hard, and it is hard. I think it's doable, but it's hard.
Okay, apologies to everyone in the queue. We have a hard stop at 1 p.m. I want to thank you, Jonathan. It was a fantastic hour. I want to thank our participants and questioners and our colleagues at Braver Angels. If you want to know more about American Purpose, go to americanpurpose.com, and I will let Jeff Gedman have the final word.
Well, Craig, thank you. I just want to add to your thanks, Craig, an elegant job of managing the conversation. Thank you so much. That's greatly appreciated. To Luke and Braver Angels, thanks. To our colleague, Frank Fukuyama, co-founder of American Purpose and chair of our editorial board, who joined today from Stanford. Frank, great to see you, and thanks. I will plug again Gabe Schoenfeld's review of John's book appearing next week in American Purpose. Sarah, you asked about George Packer's recent essay, The Four Americas in the Atlantic. John's right, he has a book out, pub date next Wednesday. We have the pleasure of hosting George Packer next Friday on his book. But really, John Rauch, you're so good, because I think one of the many failings we have, maybe in America, but certainly in Washington, is we are very frequently unclear about the problem we're trying to solve. And if you're not clear about that, you can't be clear about what methods and what elements of a strategy are most appropriate. In reading your book, for me, it clarifies a lot about how to think about these things first, and then how to manage them and how to tackle them. So I will hold up your book, The Constitution of Knowledge. I'm not very good at doing this on Zoom. Constitution of Knowledge, 2021, Brookings Press. John, congratulations. Thanks for being with us, and
Well,
Craig,
thank you.
thanks for running this conversation.
If I could just say a parting word of thanks to you, to Craig, to Luke, to everyone who's here today. And if I could also assure you that the book is better than the movie. It's the richest and most ambitious book that I've ever written. It's got lots of moving parts. I hope you read it, recommend it, and I also hope to hear from you once you do read it.
Thank you, John. Buy this book.
Great book.
Hear, hear.